Okay, so I will turn the microphone on. Go back to the welcome. Good morning to this session. This is part of the series here on integrating security risk management across humanitarian action. We're doing a total of 8 sessions across HNPW on this theme, all of them looking at how can we work with others to help make staff more safe and secure. My name is Lisa Reilly. I will be chairing the session today. Up until extremely recently, I was the director of GISF, the Global Interagency Security Forum, which does a lot of work around trying to bring these different groups together to have these conversations and break down some of the silos or cylinders of excellence, as they're sometimes referred to. So session today looking at organizational culture and power, but through the lens of security and safeguarding. The discussion around organizational culture and power is one that we have quite a lot amongst security professionals and amongst the members of GISF. For different reasons, at headquarters level, I think security staff often think that they don't actually have much power because we're often not part of the senior leadership team. Many security professionals are not taught in management skills, so they actually find it quite difficult to speak the same language as senior management. And we're certainly not seen as a priority when it comes to resourcing and funding. So there is this perception perhaps that at headquarters level, the security people do not see themselves as actually having that much power. I think at country level, it can be a very different perspective because if you think in the country offices, the security staff are often the people who have the power to say no. No, you can't go to that restaurant. No, you can't go and see your mates at 2 o'clock in the morning. No, you can't go and deliver that program. But then also where does power come from? And if you look at country level in particular, the majority of security staff are still ex-military, ex-police, and they've come from a background where they're used to having authority. They've been trained into positions of authority. And even though that might not be their role within the NGO and within the humanitarian sector, they often bring that sort of bearing with them. And then if you think about who a lot of our national staff, and in the context of a lot of the countries we work in, and think about what is the perspective of the military in those countries, it's often not considered as benign. So you have also this connection that is made in people's minds about who the security managers are. So what we want to do is look at this power organizational culture, particularly around when we talk about the safeguarding issue, because if you think of safeguarding, I mean, its root is in abuse of power. So if we think about often the perception of who we are as security managers, and I know when the safeguarding issue first really became very prominent in the humanitarian sector, a lot of security professionals were pushed out of the discussion because we were identified as part of the problem rather than part of the solution. And while we have moved on from beyond that, it's still often not easy partners to work together a lot of the time. So before I introduce our speakers, the session will be 90 minutes. We are recording the session. It isn't hybrid. That's just for note-taking purposes and to provide HNPW with a summary of the event for their website at the end. We will also be taking photographs. If any of you don't want to appear in any of these materials, do please let us know, and we'll make sure you're not there. It is an interactive event, so we do ask you to take part. So our two speakers who are joining me today, on my left, we have Christine Williamson, who comes from a human resources background and has worked for many years in the sector, and James, who works for Women as the Security and Safeguarding Director.
Correct.
So I want to start with a question to you. Have a think, just take a couple of minutes and think about what power do you hold? Think about who you are, maybe the role you have, who you work with. What are your personal characteristics? What power do you hold? Okay, so thinking about that. So turn to your neighbour, turn to somebody near you. And there's a gentleman behind you, Theo, who's and two women at the back who you might need to move a little bit. So have a look at your neighbour, the person next to you, and look at them and think, what power do they have? So just looking briefly, think about what power you think they might have. And discuss. So is your perception, what are your unconscious biases that might be impacting your belief of what power others might hold? You have to speak. Okay, I'll ask you to sort of start wrapping up your conversation. Okay, I'll try a bit harder to get you to stop and wrap up your conversation. Okay. Yeah, very badly, but trying. Oh, well, in that case, it's definitely time to stop. Okay, so as I'm moving into practicing as a psychotherapist, how did that make you feel? Have you ever thought before about what power you have and how others might perceive you? So what did it feel like to actually think about that question? So just some thoughts from you, not necessarily to answer that question, but what were your discussions? What came out of your discussions? Would you like to please? I think that's really interesting, and I think we often forget it varies from context to context, and we take our perceptions from one context to another. Really interesting. Any other thoughts?
Again, on the assumption, I think it's also building credible and building trust. Takes time, specifically when it comes to power. So I've experienced a lot of assumptions that this lady doesn't know what she's talking about. I have to do a lot to build that credibility, to have trust by the leadership that, you know, what I'm saying is actually maybe useful. And I think that's really what comes with power and how organizations are reacting and providing space for it.
Sorry, I should have done this before. Do you mind introducing yourself, and then we'll go backwards and ask you to introduce yourself?
Okay, just use them. My name is Suzanne Muis. I'm the Global Security Manager for the Lutheran World Federation in Geneva.
Sorry, and you are?
I use that, yeah. And my name is Yvan Lelay. I work for SDC as a protection advisor at HQ level. So we're talking about the HQ people going to the field and being perceived by everyone as the half god, which is of course.
Any other thoughts from anyone on your discussions? Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Angela Weens with International Medical Corps. Just in regard to this HQ thing, we had an interesting discussion about having the power, because people see that we're at HQ, but not necessarily the knowledge to and trying to convince people at field level that they actually should have the power to make some of the decisions, but they think just because we're at HQ that we are the ones who should be making these decisions when we probably should not be. So it's just like, where does the power, where should the power lie for the responsibilities?
I like a microphone. G'day, Lisa. G'day, everybody. My name's Theo Alexopoulos. I'm the Senior Advisor, Global Security for Civic. I particularly like the question about how often do we think about power. I mean, I think barely a day goes by when I'm not thinking about the power relationship that I have with the people that I'm around. I think that if it's true that we're in positions of leadership, if it's true that we think that an adaptive leadership style is important in the line of work that we undertake, then power, it's all about power, and it's dynamic and it's contextual. It's around the narrative, and I need to be thinking about, you know, how I present myself in the context in which I find myself. It's very dynamic, and in fact, you know, that's something that I try and pass on to a lot of my colleagues as well, because I think a lot of the prevailing view out there is it's very two-dimensional, you know. And I don't know, I'd like to hear from other people, but I don't know if we're talking enough about leadership. And I keep on banging the drum on that one. So when we're talking about power, as you've posited in this session, I can't help but bring that together with this thing called leadership. Yeah, thank you.
So, CHS did some really interesting sessions yesterday, in particular around leadership and organisational change. Yeah, I think you're very right about that. Any other final thoughts from this side of the room? Okay, I won't put anyone on the spot with my power as speaker that I can pick on you. But I think that is quite a nice transition. We're going to use case studies today in terms of looking at the practical situations where there has been a power sort of organizational culture issue between the sort of security and safeguarding components. So I'll hand over to James first. Sorry, you're right. Before we do that, while we're thinking about that, sorry, I've just been corrected as to what I'm supposed to be doing. So you hold a very unusual position, James, within the sector, that you have both the security and the safeguarding hat on. A lot of organisations actually see that as they're quite in conflict, those two positions. So how do you balance those two functions?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So to those who are involved primarily in safeguarding, the idea of bringing security into that little world of a silo of safeguarding is almost a heretical concept. I face a lot of resistance when people hear my role as director of safeguarding and security. And the concept of merging those two is quite unusual. However, there's a bunch of factors going on. In fact, I was presenting at a digital session last week, and we were talking about a case when I first did my first job with an NGO in Africa and Zimbabwe in 2001. And I actually took on the safeguarding role then, and it became a critical part of my job, even though we didn't understand it as safeguarding back then. And all through my career in security, I've actually been involved on that safeguarding side, on PSEAH, on gender security. And so it wasn't actually a difficult transition for me, but security is seen as something that focuses on duty of care, which is outward looking for the most part. Inward looking onto staff, protecting programs, protecting assets, facilities, and safeguarding is an outward looking sort of do no harm concept. But the problem for our sector is that safeguarding has evolved and we haven't quite kept up with it. We all remember safeguarding kind of came along for us around 2015. It was obviously hammered home with the big, very public incidents in Haiti, and we all started to very much focus on safeguarding. But the problem is we see safeguarding as a staff member to a member of a community or a program participant. We see it as a power dynamic between someone who holds access to resources and someone who has no power and can be taken advantage of. Unfortunately, safeguarding has evolved, and safeguarding is now, there are members of the community who have power to take advantage of staff members. So we now have an external to an internal. We have, even within the communities we work, sometimes we have an influence on safeguarding between two members of a community, especially when we're working with local partners. And so we have community to community. And we still have staff to staff, which has been typically an HR issue, but it can get into areas of PSAH. So safeguarding has evolved. And so the idea of bringing safeguarding and security together, as heretical as it might seem, actually has started to make sense. And if you go and look at sites like Relief Web that advertise NGO related type jobs, I know the UN is nowhere near this, but in the NGO community, you're starting to see a lot of roles popping up that are blending safeguarding and security. And so I'll be talking a little bit about that as we go along.
Thank you, James. So to you, Christine, I mentioned earlier at the beginning around this perception that we often have of security managers because of the background that they come in with and this sort of authoritarian position. And while the profile of a lot of security managers are changing, the perception of who we are is possibly not keeping up with that. So you come from a very different background. You've worked for a long period. So Christine has worked a lot with GISF about trying to bridge this HR security risk management divide. So hopefully Christine has learned a lot about us and the security side in that time. So from your perspective, where do you think the role is for security to improve the safeguarding system?
Oh, that question. I'm not on that question. Sorry. So, okay, so just say I've been field HR for about 15 years. So I was part of a first response for 2 or 3 NGOs. So when you work in the field, you understand security. You understand your security colleagues and you understand how important they are and how integral they are to the system. If we're answering the question about what security can add value in this situation, security are already playing a critical role in preventing harm to staff. There's no question about that. They're already involved in the safeguarding realm, whether we call it or not. They are already doing it. The disciplines they use and have used for years are areas in our safeguarding that we would greatly benefit in the safeguarding system. So I can talk about risk assessments, but I think we can really hammer home the fact that risk assessments, yes, you do them once or twice, but in a safeguarding case, how things evolve and change direction, having security involved in case management and looking at how we can protect people along the way is just so key. I feel that security could play a massive role in advising management on the risks of wider communication. I think we have, certainly in HR, we talk about knowledge is power, and we hold a lot of power in HR, and I think that's an abuse of power that we can talk about another time. But one thing that we should be doing and we're not doing is healthily sharing information wider and protecting communities as a result of any safeguarding cases. So one just audit I've done in another country, the knee-jerk reaction was to close projects after a couple of serious incidents of safeguarding, and that led to repercussions in all sorts of places. Yeah, and I think security could have played a massive role in how that was handled. I think we need to be integrating safeguarding into our training and awareness with security training. I certainly, and as James is saying, working in NGOs, I think befriending security, they were running training, they would come to me and red flag people and say, Christine, I'm really worried about this person before we send them out. Were you aware of these issues? They've come up in the training, you know, and for me, that's really key. And I think we should be using each other to really dig down into how we look at situational awareness, conflict management, and all sorts of things, and communication skills, and we think of safeguarding. So yeah, if that helps. I just feel that we're integrated, apart from the obvious, the crisis response. I mean, that's obviously very obvious, working together on that. I think there's so many different ways that we could be working together. So yeah.
So that is our message. Generally, we need to work better together.
Well, we do, we do.
So, but
Okay. All right, then. So my task here was to run through a bit of a case study about power of security and safeguarding. And basically, how much power do we hold and how do we mitigate excesses? So it just popped off the top of my head. Lisa mentioning a lot of security guys are perceived as ex-military and security. And the case I mentioned, my first job in 2001, was actually with a major international NGO we'd all know, whose country director had been abducted and money extorted in Zimbabwe in 2001. And I got brought into that situation as a security advisor because I just retired from the Canadian military. This major INGO's headquarters responsible for the Zimbabwe program was in Ottawa, Canada. And when the country director was abducted, they had no security management capability at all. So they called the Department of Defense. well, they called CETA, which at the time was our International Development Agency, who called the Department of Defense, said, do you have anybody who could go out to Zimbabwe and look at something for us? Department of Defense looked at their list of who just left the military and likely was unemployed and looking for something useful to do. And I got a phone call saying, would you like to go out to Zimbabwe and help this NGO? So off I went. And the task I was given was to decide in a period of 6 months whether or not to close the Zimbabwe program. And so the fate of an entire organization, all the program participants we were working with, was held in my hands. Additionally, to make it even more complicated, it was one of the first major droughts, and the WFP had just come in, and one of many NGOs that partnered with WFP, we had just started a $55 million emergency food relief program. And so if my conclusion was to shut the program down, that would have had a huge, massive impact across Zimbabwe. So using that as a mini case study, do security and safeguarding people have too much power? Well, I'm going to go through this in a moment, but there is definitely power there. Power as an individual. Your perception of security people, as Lisa was saying, is often we get a dusty broom closet as an office. We sit in the basement and they only bring us out when there's some kind of major issue. And so some ways that's true, but there is a very strong underlying power happening. So with security, I have power. So I have personally told very high-level delegations they couldn't conduct a field visit, and they didn't go. I've told them where they could go, how long they could go for, and I held the go, no-go decision each morning before they got in the cars to go out. I even kept them from getting on planes. So there is power there up to a very high level. And now that safeguarding has been added to my role formally, even though, as I said, it's always kind of existed there on the outskirts, I can have any person in the organization suspended pending an investigation. I could ruin their career. I could ruin their personal life if I botch an investigation and I don't hold confidentiality. So again, a significant amount of power sits in my hands. Now, added to that, my previous role was as the Global Security Advisor for ACT Alliance, which is 125 organizations scattered around the world. And so I had an immense amount of power that any one of those organizations, if I said something they were planning on doing was not a good idea, that had impact. Even greater than that is I was part of a small group called the ACT Alliance Security Group, of which one other member is sitting in the room at the moment. And as a group, if we advised the entire 125 member alliance that we thought something was not a good idea or not best practice, we had power. Our group was also part of GISF, which is a gathering of about 100 plus senior security people from all across the NGO community. We interact with high-level UN organizations. I had a seat along with Lisa on the UN Saving Lives Together Oversight Committee. So we had power collectively. So there's a significant amount of power there. So my particular case study, just to highlight some of this, we're looking at South Sudan and 2015. Now, as probably most of you remember, if you've been around a little while, in 2013, South Sudan took a significant turn for the worse. Fighting broke out just before the Christmas holidays. A lot of staff got trapped on the ground. There was a lot of chaos. In 2015, it kind of happened again. So it was a context of significant insecurity. Now, in this particular case, a major INGO, who was a member of our wider alliance, had a large donor project that was taking place in Equatorial State, just off in the southeast, right across from the Ethiopian border. The program managed to struggle through the last couple of years of insecurity and was winding up. And the program team was required by the donor to do an impact assessment of the program. And so there was a lot of security implications for this, obviously, to go into South Sudan. You couldn't access it through Juba and safely get from Juba out to the border area. Ethiopia at the same time was having its Gambela crisis, which was quite insecure. And so there was a lot of challenges around this. And that was going to have an impact on whether or not they could conduct the trip. So a lot of planning around mitigation and who held responsibility for the trip was involved. Now, specifically, it came down to the evaluation team had conducted a risk assessment, which we trained them to do, and they did very well. They developed a realistic plan that was going to take advantage of support from NGOs who were just across the border in Ethiopia, who were crossing the border every day to do their own programming work in South Sudan. They had numerous go and no-go decision points in their planning, and they'd come up with a pretty good plan. Within the INGO headquarters, the program director had approved the trip. The headquarters security manager, who was a member of our ACT security group, had approved the trip. Line management had approved the trip, but the trip was being held up because a regional director based in Nairobi didn't support it. He thought it was too dangerous. He thought that there wasn't enough supporting structures built into it to keep the staff safe. He didn't want to take the risk because ultimately, as the regional director, it fell under his area of responsibility. The team that wanted to do the actual trip had asked him to link up with other NGOs and UN organizations working in the area to try and gather support, both around cross borders, getting places to stay at hostels, accessing their security information about what days it might be safe to cross the border, whatnot. But the regional director did none of that. He stymied, he stonewalled, he blocked the whole thing. And so, how do we resolve this little conflict between the two groups? The headquarters that entirely approved the trip, the team that wanted to do it and were ready to do it, and the regional director. Well, they brought in the ACT Global Security Advisor. And I was given the task of ruling, is it a go or not? And so I sat at a table, very like this little image, in a little room in the ING headquarters in London. And I listened to both sides of the argument. We had the regional director on call. We had the team around the table. We had directors and the security manager around the table, and they each laid it out. And it was up to me as the security person to decide if the trip went forward, if the donor was going to be happy, and if everyone had been doing their jobs right, the way we trained them to do it. So, any guesses what the result was? The outcome, the trip was approved. The trip was approved because we trained all those staff members how to do a risk assessment, how to mitigate risk, and how to plan these kind of things. And the objective of all INGOs and UN agencies and all of us in this sphere is to help the people in the field and to continue to help them. And if you kept that in mind and we did everything we trained everyone to do, telling them, no, we're not going to let you go, kind of takes away their confidence in everything we've trained them to do and to understand. As a result, I recommended that the regional director be removed from his role. And that was for a number of reasons. He had increasingly been blockading, stalling. He wasn't doing very good work. The original incidents in 2013, where there were staff who actually died in a lot of NGOs, there was mass rapes. I think we had impacted him and he'd been suffering a lot of stress. And so he was ultimately, on the recommendation of myself, seconded by the security manager in the NGO, removed from his role. And it wasn't the first or last time. It's happened to me on a number of occasions where after a field trip, I've recommended that the country director is probably not the right person for that particular context, especially when we've had situations where we've gone from a largely quiet context and suddenly a crisis occurs and we get into a very complex humanitarian emergency, and a development person is probably not the right person to manage a high risk emergency intervention. So, do security staff have power? I think the conclusion is yes. And just to kind of wind this up, so the questions we really pose are, do security staff hold too much power? Well, if you ask us, sitting in our dusty broom closets with our binders full of risk management plans, we would say no. We struggle for a seat at the table, as Lisa mentioned. We struggle to be heard by programs when they're developing new programs. We struggle for funding. So we don't see ourselves as holding power, but it is definitely there. Do we take advantage of that power? Every day. And in fact, when you present with me with an opportunity to get my voice at a seat at the table, including sitting in this HNPW event, I will take that opportunity to influence as much as I can. But there's a risk in that, obviously. No one person's voice should have that much weight. And obviously, as a profile, as Lisa was mentioning, I'm ex-military, I have that profile, I have an authoritative manner. very difficult in a meeting with a bunch of NGO staff who are very sort of flat, horizontally organized in terms of power and responsibility. I recognize it is difficult to talk over me. So how do you manage that influence? And I always just say, if anyone asks, have good policies, lay it all out. What are your decision points? What's your risk appetite? What's your security risk management plan? Don't have it coming off the top of somebody's head. More importantly, train your people and trust them. So in the particular case of the case study, we trained people how to do risk assessments, how to plan trips to high-risk areas, and they did their jobs. And finally, remember who we serve. Always remember who we serve. So if the security manager is saying no, he's throwing up roadblocks, it might be time to sit down with the security manager and ask him why he's so risk averse. Security's job is really to make sure we stay engaged. There's never been a context anywhere on this planet when it's been too dangerous to actually engage somehow. Afghanistan, under the Taliban, South Sudan during the war, Sudan right now, there's always ways to be engaged. And so if we remember who we serve, we have good policies and we train our people well, hopefully we can manage that power issue with safeguarding and security staff. And I yield the floor.
Before we go on to Christine's case study, can you go back a slide? Okay. That last question, I think we answered the first two. Yes, we do have power. Do we sometimes take advantage of it? How do organizations manage that influence? And I think that sometimes that we disconnect between power and influence. And I think maybe just with the person you were talking to before, or if you want to go into slightly larger groups, have a think about that question and how does the organization actually manage that influence of somebody that has so much power on a day-to-day basis, but doesn't necessarily see that they have power within the senior management of the organization. Go. Okay. Attract your attention again. Any thoughts or your discussions on that influencing, how we manage that influence? Is that a hand up, Gareth?
It was, yes. Sorry, I've just come in towards the end there, but it was a really interesting discussion because I think one of the things that shifted is the balance between security and programming. So we're talking about a particular example that I had where we were balancing the security issues with the program impact issues. And I think there has been a shift towards better understanding that security role and in my engagement, particularly with UNDSS, in terms of that understanding of security as an enabler rather than as a protector. Because if you focus on the protection element and the safety element, then it's very easy to overuse that power. Whereas if you're looking at the program enabling, then you get a better balance, and I think it balances that. But I was also emphasizing slightly because I think security staff often have a lose-lose role because either something awful happens or you're blocking program delivery. So I think we do need, as program people, we need more empathy towards that as well.
Thank you. More empathy. That would be really nice. That's why we talk to you, Gareth. So hopefully you can influence others to give us empathy. Any other thoughts? Thea, go on. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, again, sorry, very, very personal comment. But coming from protection in the sector, I always enjoy very much talking with security people because they are almost the only ones who assume talking about power. And I think that humanitarian aid in general would be much better in quality, in effectiveness, but also in do no harm if power could be discussed, because the less power is discussed about, the stronger it is and the more influential and manipulating it is. And I think that's, yeah, healthy institutions should always discuss about power, because power is also power not only on, but for enabling. And for instance, the last question, how do organizations manage influence? I was telling my colleague, influence on protection and on advocacy, Switzerland is proud of having influence and having a convening power. We are a small donor, but we have strong influential power over other donors. So it's something positive we are proud of and we want to use it. It's part of a strategy. And in some contexts, I can perfectly understand that influence is perceived as something like almost manipulation and is very negative. But so I can again see that from one sector to the other, some notions appear or disappear, are negative or positive, are enabling or are constraining. It's really, really interesting. But really, security guys, really, I love you, because at least we can talk about what is at stake. And I mean, and we have to talk about power on people that is existing if we want to mitigate it. You cannot mitigate something you deny. So, okay, I'll stop here.
Thank you. Susan.
I think one important element as well is that power is, you should not assume you have power, but you have to deserve it. So this is also when it goes down from headquarters or country programs, it's the same. My fear is always that we become a department of saying no, which is not what we want. We want people to understand what the risks are. We want to give them practical reasons and how they can manage that, what they can do to control it themselves, so that their ownership comes within the people themselves. And then automatically they will sort of nurture that power that's there, but it's not that obvious because it's their own responsibility in the end, whether they will go or not, and with what kind of circumstances does the organization send them to the field. So I think that is, and then power dynamics, of course, are also key. I mean, that's also what James was saying in the case study, that what is the risk appetite of each of those in those positions, and where are the challenges there? Also, there are power dynamics too. Yeah.
And I really like, I mean, both what you were saying about the open discussion around power and trying to move the center of power. And I think somebody said before when we were talking about it, trust. And we can't function as a security if we don't have trust and if we abuse our power. But then I think there is, sort of from the protection perspective, I think there's for a long time organizations have just been trying to subdue the power that security has rather than using it as a force for good and a force for positive and an enabling. So I think that's interesting. Eh?
I think there's another dimension to it too, and when there's this overpowering trend to decentralize decision making, empower your staff and the communities that you work with. There's an interesting blowback to that approach, and that's people start looking for guidance for someone else to make that decision. And they look, and you're trying to explain to these folk, look, the power is in your hands. And I'll be there, I'll support you, I'll give you what guidance you need, or maybe even secure some resourcing for you to help you in that process. But I think sometimes we take for granted, especially when we have younger staff that are coming into the sector, they presume that power is resting with that global person or that regional headquarters, when actually, that's counter to what we're trying to do in this sector, which is push it back down that way. So perhaps my takeaway here is that when we're talking about diversity, if that's important to us, age is definitely a factor, because a corollary with age is often experience. And, there are things that we need to continually relearn and not assume that it's already incumbent on the staff that have just joined an organization. So we need to keep on coming back to these points and revisiting these things that by the time you've been in the sector so many decades, it's like, oh God, this is droll. I'm suffering here. Do I have to go back to that again? Because quite frankly, a lot of what we do is checkers, not chess. It's really simple stuff. We have this thing there where we just love complicating things for ourselves, especially as we get older. We get all zen over things, right? And I'm sure you've well, at least I've encountered that. I like to really remind myself, especially in a position of leadership, we have to revisit these things, and we need to keep it simple and not overcomplicate it. That power must rest with our staff, and they need to be taught how to yield it. And I think that's the trick.
Yeah, please.
You just spurred a little thought, and it's around power and also the responsibility of power. And that sometimes the tendency for senior leadership teams to turn to the security person to ask that tough question. So I remember when the second intifada broke out between Israel and the Palestinian territories, we had a consultant in one of our organizations sitting in a hotel in the West Bank. And the decision was, bombs are falling, artillery is going off. The decision was, do they try to get out, or do we leave them at the hotel and hope that the hotel doesn't get hit? And all the directors gathered, the board was consulted, everyone was asked, what is the decision? We need to make a decision right now. Do we advise this staff member to try and get across the border? Which, if anyone's ever crossed that border, is not the safest thing to do at the best of times. And they all turned to the security person to make the call. And it's one thing whenever I'm training people in the security role, is I remind them that you have power, and with that comes responsibility. The decisions you make to turn left, to turn right, to go, to not go, could have the ultimate impact on your staff. They could die based on something you recommend. And you have to have the moral strength to be able to understand that and still have the courage to make a call. And sometimes that is that power and responsibility relationship that comes with security, that sometimes decisions do get pushed onto you because everyone else just turns to the security focal point or the security manager or director to make that tough call.
Yeah, and I think that flags something. So I found the leadership discussions and the organizational change discussions yesterday with CHS really interesting. But one of the things that came out of that is a lack of training of leadership. So is there something that also is, what we're saying here is, do we train our leaders in how to understand the power they have and how they should use it? And I think the answer to that is probably no, certainly judging by some of the sniggering I can see. So I think on that note, I will hand over to Christine, who's a very different case study.
So, yes, so my case, what I want to do is look at the power dynamics in a study that I conducted very recently, and how perhaps security could have really helped with that. Because just on the note of power and security, I do think security can help us understand the power dynamics because they've experienced them and help others understand the power they have. I think we all have a role to play there. So my case study is looking outwards slightly, enabling safe working cultures. What I want to look at is how security professionals can help build trust into a safety, build trust and safety into a safeguarding system. And I think that's probably the main question I want to answer today. So the case study. So following several complaints and 2 staff terminations for child abuse in 3 refugee camps, an inquiry took place to understand if there was anything in the culture of this country office or organisation that may have enabled the abuse to happen and to go unreported for so long, because this was going on for a long time, as it turned out. The audit team, which I was a part of, interviewed a cross-section of staff over 4 locations. It's very different to a safeguarding audit. It's not, I'm not asking what policies do you have? Do you know how to use them? I want to know how they interpret them. I want to look at how people are held to account. How do they see the power in their organisation? Where do they think it sits? And what support do you receive? Those are the sorts of things we were looking at when we interviewed lots and lots of people. I'm looking at the wrong thing here. So what were the findings? Our findings were that there had been a misuse of power. There were acceptable workplace behaviours that were defined from the perspectives of those with power. And that they didn't just come from within the organisation. We're talking about societal power. This particular country had gone through atrocities over the years, and there certainly was a culture of silence, for instance, for protection. The organisation and societal culture, what we found, there was a lack of contextualisation of the culture in the code of conduct within the organisation. The understanding of how it landed in this particular context was just unknown. A lot of the complaints from people we spoke with said, it's all well and good having a code of conduct from HQ, but actually there are behaviours here that we think are okay, that the code of conduct says are not. And no one had taken the time to interpret that. And a speaking out culture certainly was not in the culture of silence. And it's not just about losing their job or anything like that. They genuinely thought the right thing to do was stay quiet in certain circumstances. So, and they genuinely backed that up. There was a huge amount of lack of leadership. I don't know why, but leadership decided not to visit the refugee camps. There wasn't really any direct communication, and there seemed to be a vacuum of information at different levels of seniority. The behaviours, I'm not saying rightly or wrongly, or whether they're naive or they just felt it wasn't their place, but there was an absolute lack of leadership throughout this whole process. And I think if you can get ahead of some of the communication, that would have been really helpful. Huge amounts of breaches of privacy in the reporting, the case management process. It's hard to express, but basically staff had no trust in the organisation's ability to keep personal information safe. They just lost trust. If you can't trust your organisation to look after your data and keep things private, and they fear that information is going to get leaked, then your trust is broken down completely. And especially if one of those functions is HR, HR holds knowledge. And it can abuse that, whether it thinks it's doing it rightly, and that may be incompetence, or it genuinely is abusing it. Of course, there was fear of reprisals. Staff were concerned about information about them being used against them. The reporting, just to say, it took 3 attempts for this person to report before taken seriously. Yeah, I mean, I'm talking, what you hope is this never happens in your organization, but this organization has everything in its place, you know, it's all its systems. So this comes down to people's behaviors and leadership and managers and those in power. So it's not just about seniority, but functional power. So the safeguarding champion just didn't take the call very seriously and didn't pass on the information in the right way. That all led to lack of reporting, further reporting. So it took 2 years for these things to surface. We're talking about children here. It is quite, you know, the protections in place because of it around everybody. I mean, there's a saying, and I think I heard it in the last session, that, you know, you should expect abuse to happen. We have to protect everyone from it, don't expect it not to happen. So, yeah. And of course, then the decreased morale in the whole organization. I mean, the passing on of information, the fact that concerns weren't raised, there was retaliation against the reporters. They felt unsafe. There was tears in all our meetings. You know, it was really quite shocking. And yet, leadership still hadn't done anything. And then there was obviously a huge damage to the organization's reputation. Most staff believe the incidents and the way the cases were managed really did seriously damage reputation, and they didn't know who to trust. And once something's gone wrong at the top of the chain, that's a mark on everyone, isn't it? It's not just HR or safeguarding. There's a sense that, well, actually, these decisions are made at the highest level, so therefore all know. So that's pretty brutal, I know, but I think the organization, when we fed this back to them, absolutely in shock. They absolutely had no idea some of this was going on. So before I go into what I feel are what we ended up learning and what we did about it, I just thought it'd be useful for again, our chat with our neighbor, is when you think about, because I look at a program as interrelated, you know, functions, HR, security, everything. And I looked at it and saw what was happening. There was so much risk in this situation. And I just wondered if we could discuss how we feel security professionals could have helped build trust into that system, bearing in mind all the things that we've just talked about. And I just wonder if you had any thoughts on that, and if you want to have a chat with your neighbour first before we talk about it. But just on that case alone, and I'm very happy to just go back to that previous slide, all those issues, where do you feel security could have come into that? I'm sure James has got some thoughts as well. Can I ask you just to chat with your neighbours just for a moment? Thank you. So where are we? 10 past. Any thoughts? Would anyone like to just give some ideas of how security, I'm going to just keep talking because I know everyone then will start turning around. On any of those areas that you feel security could play a valuable role. Any thoughts? Go for it.
I can get it going. So a few things that we were talking about before was, help me out here, because there are only three, right? One was to do with, well, out of not in the same order that we discussed them, but one was the importance of security, understanding what its limits are. And that while we are working with HR around safeguarding issues, we need to know that we might not necessarily, probably 99% of the time, we don't have the ability to investigate safeguarding issues. So we need to be able to, we need to be humble enough, or at least wise to our limitations, and point our organization in the right direction. Because it might not even be something that HR needs to deal with. So that's one point. It's around investigations. Trust, of course, is important. Perception, very much, I think, is probably as big, if not bigger, than trust, because the perception of staff is really important around safeguarding. And how do we manage perception? I think one answer to that question is training. And keeping it proportional, keeping it balanced. If it's important that we give compliance training around fraud every year to all of our staff, and we're not doing it for safeguarding, I mean, that don't run true to me. So, you know, I would suggest that that's a good starting point. If staff are receiving this mandatory training as a start to understand that will go some ways to building a perception that there is a process and a system in place, and that they understand, they're aware of it, and that fosters trust as well. There was another one too. I don't remember what it was. Oh yeah, confidentiality. So yeah, the third point we discussed was confidentiality, which is to say, security folk need to be able to foster the perception, but also in reality, a system that is confidential. And when you're handing over from what might have manifested itself as a security incident up front, but then morphs into a safeguarding issue that then also brings in HR, very quickly it blossoms into every man and his dog knowing about it. That makes sense, right? So you need to be able to manage that chain of information sharing in the interests of the accused and the accuser, for example. And when we hand over to investigator, they need to know that the confidential hasn't been breached. So I think as a role of security, we need to have that system set up and working, and might not be perfect. I would suggest it'd be very hard to find an organization that has a perfect system, but damn it, it's important, because if you don't get it right, it can really bite your bum, bite you in the bum.
Thank you.
Thank you. 3 weeks ago, I was in Nepal doing an SEA investigation, sexual exploitation and abuse investigation training for our staff in Asia, and as a security person, together with our safeguarding and complaints response coordinator. And I think what is really important here, of course, as the moment that investigation starts, a risk assessment is key to identify what are the risks for the subject of complaint, of course, the survivors, the whistleblowers. And I have noticed, and I've done this also in Uganda for East Africa last year, the way we did that jointly together was very insightful for the team, because they have learned also to understand better how to do risk assessments, really practical. It was a very practical session, and understanding that they actually can manage that as potential investigators for the future. Child safeguarding is different. We will never do that internally. Of course, that's a different, that we have outsourcing that for specialists, because it's extremely difficult. But I think the fact here is that the lead investigator, or maybe the complaints response person within a specific context, needs to assess, do I need a security person here? Yes or no? Does it mean only advice, or is it the person be part of the investigation team, because the risks are really high for doing this, including the investigation team that might need to travel. So I think, and we have been sort of trying to struggle with that and finding our ways. We are still learning. So I'm open to hear more from others, the experiences. But I think there's really a crucial collaboration needed between those two. And I'm happy you have two roles there.
James, do you have anything to say? Do you want to?
Yeah, and in fact, that's very true. And in fact, I've done many security jobs. And so when the opportunity to take on the safeguarding hat in a new role came up, I took it on because I thought, okay, now I'm going to learn something new. It was fascinating. You know, I finally, after 20, 30 years in the business, I get to learn something new. Turns out, actually, a lot of the skill sets that I brought across worked out pretty well. And in terms of safeguarding investigations, we had no system in Women for Women International, which is quite odd. So I immediately, putting on my security hat, first off, whenever we get a complaint through anything, it immediately gets a case number. No one in the organization will ever refer to a survivor by name. The survivor, if they choose, can choose a pseudonym. So if we ever mention a name, it's never the person's name. So immediately we slap confidentiality because that is the number one. And I am now responsible for all investigations in our organization, which include finance, fraud, and corruption, safeguarding, staff-on-staff HR complaints, digital risk, including data loss or GDPR breaches, which doesn't mean I'm the investigator, but I'm responsible for how investigations are conducted. Every single person signs a confidentiality agreement, and it's been explained even to the highest level of management that any breach of the confidentiality agreement is cause for termination of employment with cause. And so some of those things you bring across the board from security actually kind of apply to safeguarding, but it is a learning. And in my very first investigation, it was a safeguarding one. I did make some mistakes. I am a white, over middle-aged male in a certain sort of frame that is not probably the best person to talk to a young woman who feels that she had been assaulted by another member of staff. I did my best, but I've recognized that I have limitations there. And so I've got to work on our safeguarding capacity and training investigators, just like you were doing. But that linkage between safeguarding and security, I think is just such a natural fit, and especially true. And I was bringing this up in the last session, and I'll make this quick. Most HR professionals, especially at the headquarters level, are rarely out in the field. The understanding of the field context for HR security professionals at a high level just really isn't there. You don't get a lot of people who come through the HR sort of career path in the NGO or probably the UN community that have spent a lot of time in project areas, interacting with local populations. And so sometimes their grasp isn't the best, but the security people, we live in the field. We know the people, especially we're working through our local security staff. So we have that contextual package as well that we can bring to the table. So I just find for so many reasons that linkage between safeguard and security is key. I'll shut up.
Thank you. Great. Any more comments before I move on? No? So thanks for your feedback. I think you'd love to know what we learned from this or what we did. I mean, in the answer to your where can security add value or even build a safer system, what we've come up with or what we presented as recommendations integrated security into these. Obviously, I'm going to start with leadership. So what did we learn? We need to be better at supporting leaders in how to promote safeguarding principles. We need to help our leaders be able to talk about sex, perhaps. We need to be make it normalizing some of these things. I'm not saying in every culture that's going to be easy, but we've got to start helping them do this. And it's about management behaviors themselves and how they role model behaviors. It's about confidentiality. It's about handling communications sensitively. It's about prioritizing those at risk. It's about being present. What these leaders were not present, and acting on findings swiftly. If you want to maintain trust on a day-to-day basis, you've got to demonstrate that this is what you're committed to. So leadership goes without saying. The one thing that obviously shone through this was understanding the societal culture and contextualizing your systems and your practices that take that into account. So a culture of secrecy in this situation led to no one feeling safe to speak out. It wasn't a safe speaking up culture. They felt that they have more right to privacy than speaking out. That was their right. And once you understand that, then you can unpack it. And it takes time to integrate both cultures, by the way, with national teams. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take time, and we've got to work out how we're going to do that better. And that is a safety issue. Security training, I've mentioned already, how security is trained to spot risky behavior and red flags. I think they are much more attuned to that than most of our trainers. If I'm honest, I'd rather be doing this sort of training or safeguarding training with security. If I'm honest, I think together would be great. With regards to case management, it's a huge process and it takes so many twists and turns. I can do a risk assessment one day and the whole thing's changed the next day because someone else has behaved in a different, part of the whoever's involved has done something. So we need to be transparent on how cases are managed. We need to have safe reporting and good investigations. Our investigators need to ask trauma-informed questions. We need to remember who we are interviewing and who we are when we interview. We need to watch investigation breaches. We need to take immediate steps to address breaches. I've just been recently involved with a huge investigation breach, which led to another investigation running alongside the one we were doing. And the resources involved in that, it happened to be a manager that just told someone else about, a case that they were dealing with, and it got back to the reporter. We just need to be really, really careful about those breaches. And I think we need to build into our risk assessments the potential risk of information being leaked. I don't think we should assume it won't be. I think you assume information will be leaked and you build a risk assessment around it in the case that it happens. And then you take immediate steps with breaches within the investigation. So obviously we had to suspend staff. This is a different case, by the way, but I think these things do happen. You need to take immediate steps, address the breach, investigate. You need to inform staff and stakeholders all the time of what's going on. This was not happening in the refugee case. No one knew what was happening. They kind of did. You had certain people wrapping their arms around the information, not daring to share anything, when I think actually if we'd done a risk assessment on what we could share, that would have been more helpful. We need to understand what it means to take a survivor-centered approach. I think we're talking of this language now, but I don't think it's really integrated into our systems and practices as it should be. What I'm seeing where we are looking through that lens very early on, even through the risk assessment, better outcomes all through, better outcomes, and much more preventative. Sometimes what you're trying to do is prevent things getting worse. That's our duty of care. Obviously, better not to have happened in the first place, but we are meant to stop things getting worse. And we are often hearing that some staff felt so upset after the way they've been treated by the organisation. And in some situations, that was traumatizing them more. Engagement. We need to engage with staff and stakeholders to rebuild trust and address any concerns they may have. So let's not give up. We've made a mistake. We've leaked something. Let's address it. Let's use this as an opportunity to demonstrate actually we're in this with you. We are committed to this and we're going to get this right. And coming back again to data management, how we collect and analyze data, a norm in security, which I feel that we can bring into safeguarding, is how we safely share data to strengthen our safeguarding practices, particularly around communication as well. I'm working a lot on privacy at the moment, and I feel that part of the trust, a lot of the trust is around privacy of information. So I just feel that security could bring a lot into that. And that's our learning. It's not all our learning, but the main points.
Great, thank you very much, Christine. So we have a very few minutes left. So just final opportunity for any thoughts. Yes, Gareth?
Yeah, so a couple of points for me. One that really picking up Christine there is the information sharing piece, because we struggle with this in a lot of our conversation about safeguarding, because when people hear information sharing, they think immediately personally identifiable information. And this is where there's that important distinction between confidentiality and secrecy. So one of the tasks I think we have is to differentiate between sharing personally identifiable information, which we clearly don't want to do because that's protection risks and everything else. But there's no reason not to share that we've got cases in our organizations, that we have these issues, that and so I think differentiating between those two is really important. And then this links back to, as we were discussing in the session earlier this morning about the culture change, to say, yes, this does happen. It's not, we can talk about the general facts without exposing individuals to risk. And I think that's a big part of then shifting our culture. And there was also another point about the kind of this cultural elements. It's been quite interesting. I just came back from Kabul. And one of the challenges we often have on safeguarding is people feel it's an African problem because that's where the high profile cases tend to have happened. But actually talking to colleagues working on PSEH and in Kabul who are saying, yes, they do have cases reported, they do follow up on them. So it does mean, it recognizes it happens even in the most conservative societies, and actually the risks are even greater there because the consequences of reporting and of inappropriate information disclosure are so much more extreme. So yeah, I just wanted to pick up on those points, but thanks, and look forward to talking more about this.
And I think that really highlights one of the similarities between security and safeguarding. We all think all of the information we have is confidential and we keep it a secret. And it's an ongoing struggle within the security component to be more open. And I love the distinguishing between secrecy and confidentiality. I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, the example that I'm aware of, there was a safeguarding incident which was fed into the human resources component of an organization. They kept the information so secret that something leaked out at country level that there was a separate security investigation going on into the same incident by two people who sat 3 meters apart at headquarters, who had no idea that they were both investigating the same incident. So I think this is a really good example of where, recognizing that some information will slip out. How do you manage that and how do you keep it together? Any other thoughts or comments from anyone?
I'm a bit jealous with all these people who have the chance to go to the field. I got bored, and suddenly I realized that there was maybe also the kind of power that we hold. We have the power of remaining not anonymous, but going to the field. We are no one, and we can come back. We are not under the social control that people who stay there are, and I think that's also kind of type of power. This one, for being able to get out of the grid, the power grid of social control. So.
I think that's a really interesting point, and I think it also highlights the them and us attitude between people at country level and headquarters, and that often there's that communication gap between country and headquarters, and what do they hide at a country level from somebody who just does short visits in from headquarters in terms of that understanding of the culture. Interesting. Any final points from you two up here?
No.
No, no.
Okay. What I will do, I will leave that slide up, which is the other sessions that are still to come around security risk management and the integration across humanitarian action. I would like to say thank you very much to James and Christine. Can we say thank you to them? And thank you to the small audience for the amount of work that you had to do in this session. And I really hate to quote Theo in my wrap up, just on principle, but I think being wise to our limitations is something that we need to understand. So on that note, thank you very much.
Thank you.